Thank you, Chairman Corker. Thank you, Director Pompeo, for your willingness to step forward and once again serve our country. To your family and to you for what has been a long career of public service in the United States military, as an elected official, as the director of the CIA, and now for this position. I appreciated the conversation we had yesterday and the opportunity to follow up on some of the issues we discussed. And I am optimistic you would follow through on your commitment to fight for the State Department, for USAID, for resources and their personnel. I think many of us on this committee have heard over the last 15 months real concerns about management, morale, budget cuts, and the State Department, USAID, and I'm optimistic you would fight for those professionals and you would respect their service. I'm also well aware you have a strong and close relationship with the President, and as we discussed, I think a key role for America's chief diplomat is to advance not just our narrow interests, our security or economic interests, but to also see our values as being a key part of those interests. And I hope that you will both advise the President and on occasion stand up to him if he is doing things with which you disagree, and that you will ensure that he considers the vital role of diplomacy in responding to the threats we face around the world. So let me just follow up, if I might, for a moment on a line of questioning two of my colleagues pursued. You are a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School. I couldn't get into Harvard. I went to Yale Law School. And as such, I'd assume that you'd agree that rule of law is absolutely essential to the values that define our democracy. Is that correct?
Senator, I only spoke publicly 5 times as a CIA director. Each time I spoke publicly, I spoke to, and maybe there's an exception, but each time I spoke at some length about the importance of the rule of law at the CIA, how we were a creature of law, and how if we didn't do that, the fundamental failure that would lead to. I believed it as a CIA director, I believed it all my life, and I'll believe it as the Secretary of State if I'm confirmed as well, Senator.
Well, and I think you made a strong statement that if confirmed, it'd be the 7th time you'd raise your hand and swear an oath to the Constitution. So let me just go back to a line of questioning. President Trump described Special Counsel Mueller's investigation as an attack on what we all stand for, and he has repeatedly threatened to fire Robert Mueller. He's threatened the investigation, he's threatened the Attorney General in his tweets in ways I find troubling. Do you believe Special Counsel Mueller's investigation is an attack on our country and all we stand for?
Senator, I hope you'll take this the right way. As the director of the CIA, I've been involved in that investigation. I've worked with Senators Burr and Warner and with Congressmen on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. I have been a participant in Special Counsel Mueller's activity. I think anything I say with respect, I want to avoid that today. I apologize that I can't speak more fully to that, but I hope you'll respect the fact that everything that I was asked to do in my role as CIA director related to any of these investigations I've done with as much thoroughness, as much depth, and as much alacrity as our organization could achieve.
Well, I'm convinced that if the President were to fire the special counsel or to interfere with this investigation by firing Rod Rosenstein with an intention to then interfere with and shut down this investigation, that it would put the rule of law genuinely at risk. If that were the case, and if that happened, would you resign your post as Secretary of State in order to demonstrate that we are a nation of laws, not of men?
Senator, I haven't given that question any thought. My instincts tell me no. My instincts tell me that my obligation to continue to serve as America's senior diplomat will be more important at increased times of political domestic turmoil. We've seen this in America before, right? This wouldn't be the first time that there's been enormous political turmoil. My recollection of the history is that previous secretaries of state stayed the course, continued to do their work, continued to do the requirements, statutory and constitutional, that they had. Having not given it a great deal of thought, I'm confident that that's the path that I would take.
Well, Director Pompeo, I'd urge you to give it some thought. Many of us are giving it some real thought and have had to do so for months. And it is regrettable, I think, that we're in a place where we're seriously discussing this rather than diving into the policy questions that face us around the world. But I think there are moments when our values and what we do teaches to the world. And whether the right course is to resign or to engage and to speak out against it and to counsel against it and to then work to restore the rule of law, we could debate. But I think it's vital that we have as our chief diplomat someone who understands our values, as I believe you do, and who is willing to fight for them even by taking dramatic steps like a resignation in order to signal vigorous disapproval of what the president's done or might do. Let me move on to another area, if I might. When discussing Saddam Hussein, President Trump has said, and I quote, "He was a bad guy, a really bad guy. But you know what he did well? He killed terrorists. He did that so good. They didn't read them their rights. They didn't talk. They were terrorists. It was over." And while we could debate whether or not Saddam Hussein was a good guy or a bad guy, I think it's important. This is another example, much like something we discussed, the president of the Philippines and his conduct, where challenging an ally or challenging the historical record on behalf of our rights is important and our values. So to what extent do you think that actions that curtail human rights and erode processes like due process and the rule of law by foreign governments actually fuels instability, strengthens terrorist threats, that when we are perceived as being on the side of a quick and violent result rather than the rule of law and a just result, it actually makes us less safe?
Senator, I agree. I think I agree with the. If I understood the premise of your question correctly, I think I agree with it as laid out. But I'll try and repeat it for you and see if I got it right. I agree. American behavior matters. The way we behave around the world, our activities, the things we choose to do and not to do matter. They are reflective. One of the best memories I've had so far as CIA director is I was with a partner intelligence service leader who'd been at this a lot longer than I had. And we were walking in a dusty place, and CIA had done great work alongside them. They'd been a great partner for us as well. And he turned to me and he said, "You know the most important thing that America has done for my team? It's great that you give us some help. It's great that you teach us some technology and some tools. The most important thing you've done for us is you've set an example. CIA officers behaving professionally, having boundaries, existing under the rule of law, communicating, all the professional behavior that your officers have exhibited has been the most important thing you've done for our organization. You've made us better." And so, to your point, I think that's an example where, put aside the policy or the work that we did, the substantive work we did, it was America's norms that had proven truly valuable to this foreign partner. I was incredibly proud to be the director.
I'm glad to hear that example and to hear you repeat our shared commitment to the rule of law as a core American value. But I do think that we are in a time when we are going to have to confront questions about what we are willing to do in order to demonstrate our fealty to the rule of law as a foundational principle of our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chairman Corker, and thank you, Director Pompeo. On those same topics, we had a very constructive conversation yesterday, and I'm confident that you would be a good advocate for the career professionals of the State Department and USAID. And so rather than focus on some of the management and budget and so forth, I'm going to focus on areas where I've still got some unresolved questions and would rather have a more pointed exchange. But I wanted to make sure I recognize that I think you've got clarity about the importance of the mission and the role and deep respect for the professionals who carry out this job. You said in your prepared statement that representing America also requires promoting America's ideals, values, and priorities to those who ultimately determine the trajectory of geopolitics, the voters and citizens of the world. And I agree with you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce for the record an article from the Pew Research Center, which reflects trends that other surveys of the world and world leaders have also revealed. The Center's 2017 annual survey looked at global levels of confidence in President Trump, in Russian President Vladimir Putin, in Chinese President Xi Jinping, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and their confidence that they would do the right thing for the world. And it was striking that for the first time there's been real slippage. Are you concerned to see polls such as this that for the first time ever say more people around the world or more leaders around the world trust Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping to lead the world in the right direction than America under Donald Trump's leadership?
Senator, I definitely want people to understand accurately. Right? It's not an attempt to deceive, but rather to accurately have the people of the world understand the beacon of democracy that the United States of America is. We talked just a moment ago with Senator Portman about misinformation and the capacity to move that around the world. We diligently to make sure that it doesn't have an impact. And I don't know, I couldn't tell you the depths of the poll, and I don't know of it. But it is the case. There are actors in the world seeking to achieve exactly the perception that you laid out there, and we need to make sure that we're doing all that we can to counter that perception of the United States.
I'm sure you'd agree that the United States has and promotes quite different values than China.
Deeply, deeply different.
And so I'd be interested in both what your strategy would be for investing in the resources needed to push back on this difference, and what role do you think our values should play, both in our bilateral relationship with China and in how we engage in the world. I've had a concern that over the last 15 months, our values weren't as front and center as our interests more narrowly understood. How do we change that in our bilateral relationship with China and more broadly around the world?
I believe that our values often drive. We see sometimes you'll see people characterize our interest as being in juxtaposition or in conflict with our values. That may well from time to time be the case. I think most often, Senator, that actually our values drive those interests. We should be unashamed about that. We should speak to the reason we operate the way we do. We should defend American values every place we go. It means, with respect to China, perhaps, but certainly with respect to other countries, hard conversations. Some days, perhaps, Senator, trade-offs as well. We do end up having to deal with unsavory characters from time to time to achieve an outcome that we deem important to American national security. But we should never do that we should never do that exclusively. That is, we should never put away this American vision for the things that make societies most successful and people be able to achieve what it is that they seek to. We should be proud of that, and we should always have that as part of the discussion.
And I think that's a vision that doesn't just tolerate, but celebrates our differences.
Absolutely.
And as the co-chair of the Senate Human Rights Caucus with Senator Tillis, I'm concerned about how we make sure that we make that celebration of difference a piece of our foreign policy. I'd be interested in whether you think LGBTQ rights are human rights, and whether you would advocate for them as a piece of a broader agenda of advocating for diversity, and what your strategy is for preventing partners like Turkey and Egypt and the Philippines that have genuinely slid on their respect and recognition for rights, broadly understood, from moving further away from our core values.
I think there were three questions there, Senator. Let me try. I deeply believe that LGBTQ persons have every right that every other person in the world would have. We have many countries in the world that don't honor that don't reflect that behave, that conduct heinous activity against those persons. We have a responsibility when we're dealing with those countries to do our best to have an impact, to make them recognize the fundamental dignity of every human being in the same way that we do here in the United States.
Last question, if I might, Mr. Chairman. There was some exchange you had previously about statements you made as an elected official right after the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, and whether that sends a message to America's Muslims, the community within our country, and the leaders around the world you'll need to work with as a chief diplomat. Just tell me something about who the leaders are in the Muslim world you'll be willing to work closely with, and what priority you would place on changing that perception of your views given by a few statements that, as we discussed yesterday, you think were taken out of context. Yeah. I think it's important to have a sense on the record of your view of the religion of Islam and of our partnerships in the Muslim world.
Let me try and do that. But let me try and give evidence. I've worked with our intelligence partners throughout a broad range of Muslim majority countries. I've worked with them closely. We've done very difficult things together. It might be difficult for you to chase some of them down, but I think if you could speak to them, you'd find that the view that you suggested that some have seen from that remark, they'd be very different to them. I think they have come to understand that I deeply honor their religion. I honor their commitment to that. Where it causes some of the challenges that you asked in your previous question, we've tried to push back even at the lowly intelligence level. We've taken on some of these human rights issues in a crisp and square way. I assure you that I'll continue to do that if I'm confirmed into this new position as well.
Thank you for your answers. Thank you.